In a world increasingly divided by lines we draw ourselves, politics, power, profit, there's a quiet truth we try to ignore, and that is we are more connected than we think. We scroll past suffering, we choose teams, we race towards progress while forgetting people. And somewhere along the way, we've started to mistake disconnection for strength, detachment for leadership, and silence for peace. But what if the real strength we need, and what if the most radical act left is empathy? Our guest today believes it is. Mimi Nicklin is not just an author or speaker, she's someone who is successfully cutting through the noise, and empathy is her Sentoku knife. Featured on BBC News, Forbes, Harvard Business Review, and more, her work has touched governments, global companies, and individuals longing for something real. It is so important to me that her message is brought to the You Live and You Learn audience as well. So, if empathy is the answer, can it be taught? To our seasoned leaders, to our rising stars, to our life partners, and those we choose to surround ourselves with. Mimi, welcome to the You Live and You Learn podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're so thrilled to have you. And Mimi, I don't want to waste any time. So we are going to start and get deep right away. So, based on your experiences, your observations, your conversations with leaders around the world, how would you describe the world we live in today?
Oh, that is a big question to start the morning, isn't it? We are living in the most disconnected period of our lives. I think, you touched on that in your introduction, that we're more connected theoretically than ever before, and yet we're more lonely. So, according to the data, 52% of us are suffering with loneliness. And if you listen to people like the Surgeon General of the USA, that loneliness is literally costing us our lives and is as dangerous to us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We're meant to be together, right? We're a pro social species. So when I look at the world around us, this is what really troubles me and drives me to do the work I do, is looking at how we actually reconnect that world that is becoming so fragmented. We have such a huge amount of segmentation, isolation, segregation, discrimination, all the Asians this morning pulling us apart. But like you said earlier, there are many more things that can put us together. You have to make an intentional decision to do so.
So, Mimi, the way you are making it sound, it really is not just a leadership problem. So, do you think this is a human crisis?
I think it probably is. And as sad as that sounds, it also means that we have a realization of what there is out there for us to fix. I think there's a huge amount that leaders can do, like a role that they can play in fixing this, as all of us can. And I think this show actually goes to the very core of that, which is that I believe that everyone is leading someone. So you don't have to be the CEO or the CHRO to play a role in reconnecting your people, your teams, and our communities. You just have to be a good human, right? We just have to bring awareness, Ash, to what this is, to this empathy deficit, this lack of connectivity out there in the world. And once we establish that awareness, we can shift to some intention to filling it. But is it a crisis? Yes, I think it is.
And what is that cost if we don't address it? Because here's what I'm thinking about is, and I'm so glad you mentioned that this is for everyone and everyone is leading someone,
Mm.
because this audience ranges from young professionals who haven't led a team before to folks who can't even recall a time when they weren't leading a team. And so the broad spectrum is there. And so, what is that cost if we continue to choose detachment?
So I think we can measure that cost in a couple of different ways. But to give us all a benchmark, a number, everybody loves a number, right?
Mhm.
It is actually costing us $8.9 trillion a year, which is the estimated loss in productivity due to three key parts of this: disengagement, disconnection, and presenteeism. So the empathy deficit, which probably we'll come on to talk about, but this lack of empathy, this lack of connection, was actually coined by Barack Obama in 2006, so well before he was the president. He stood up and he said to his audience that day, "I know I'm here to talk about our federal deficit, but I think we should be talking about our empathy deficit." The reason I bring that up now to answer your question is that what Barack Obama was talking about was the cost to the economy from a a federal, an economic, a financial point of view of continuing to see a disconnected, in this case, nation, but of course we can talk about the world at large. So the cost of this is impacting our economy. It is slowing down the growth, or at least stalling the growth of organizations all over the place, because of course organizations are made of people, and when people aren't connected, they don't reach their potential. But there is also a huge social cost, which is what you touched on in your last question around, is this a social human crisis? When we look at 330 million people saying that they don't have a single friend, nearly 400 million people suffering with anxiety, and the highest suicide rates that we've seen in history. So there are huge social costs to this as well. But from a business world, we're looking at around $9 trillion a year, which is equal to 9% of global GDP.
Who knew you can put a dollar value to the lack of empathy? And for my own understanding, for our audience's understanding, can you describe what you meant by empathy deficit and just bring that to light a little bit more in simple terms? I think for those who are really trying to understand the value that you're bringing to the table here.
Yeah, absolutely. Fundamentally, what the empathy deficit or empathy gap talks to is the lack of connectivity in our world, the lack of understanding of an other, of those around us. If we define empathy for a moment so that we're on the same page, empathy is fundamentally perspective taking. This is a skill set, Ash. It is built into your brain, empathy. It's built into the prefrontal cortex of your brain. You were born with it, and you were born with it to be able to connect to others because we are a pro social species. This is an evolutionary skill set. So, when you think about the empathy deficit, it is the lack of the ability to do exactly that, the lack at large of people being able to take the perspective of others, to understand those that they're working with, that they're leading, that they're building communities with, or perhaps living in a home with, right? So, this is probably the hard skill of our times. I know people often talk about soft skills. I always believe we need to debunk it. We're talking about the lack of connectivity at large between our people. And it's harming us, as we've said, in many, many ways.
And I mean, you just mentioned this. We're all born with it, and yet
Mm.
we have a deficit of it. And it's about being aware of how to practice this skill in your daily life. And so I want to make sure we get to this at the end because I will want to ask, how can we practice it? If everyone is born with it,
Mm.
we all have the capacity to be empathetic as we go through this, because I think if anything anyone takes away from this podcast is how to practice empathy in your daily life. So I really want to make sure we touch on that. Now that we've kind of set the groundwork here on the why of empathy and what empathy truly is, I'm also very curious to know, why not respect? Why not trust? Why not sympathy? Why empathy?
Well, for me, if I touch a little bit on how I got here, I mean, Ash, people always ask me, how did you discover this purpose, right? How did empathy enter your life? And I always say to people that I didn't search for my purpose, but my purpose found me. So somehow empathy became me, and it really is the whole of me. I mean, there's not a minute of a day when I'm not living this. So is it my work? Yes, but more than that, in its truest form, this is just who I am. So when you ask me the question, why empathy? Honestly, I don't know, right? That's probably what I was born to do. But on a more strategic level, why empathy? Because this is a skill set that is so directly connected to so many of the things that we want to see in a thriving nation and a thriving world. Some of the other things you said there, for example, respect or sympathy, these are all phenomenal facets that we have as human beings that we can use to create a better world, and we should. But underpinning nearly all of them, nearly always, is empathy, is some form of understanding. So, for example, how can I respect you if I don't understand you? How can I include you if I don't understand you? How can I create better policies in the workplace, better well being, a more motivating environment if I don't understand the people I'm creating it for? So, what I found as I built my own journey in this space, Ash, was that what I thought in the beginning was fundamentally a leadership skill set that I was going to teach to the world, I realized slowly, this is a very, very paced journey, but slowly that this is actually within and underneath every single thing we do in the day as leaders, as people, as women. And that at times can be a little overwhelming because you think, wow, we need to teach this to everyone all the time. But it's also phenomenally freeing because you realize that if we do shows exactly like this, so thank you for having me,
Absolutely.
and talk about it, I really do believe that the more the world talks about empathy, the more empathy the world will have. And imagine the impact we could be making. So there are many facets to this and many wonderful skills that we should bring to enhance it. But I believe that in most relationships, most areas of our business and personal lives, empathy is kind of the table stakes.
It's one of those you really think about because when it comes to problem solving, let's say, and you're speaking to someone, the one thing you want to do is try and understand them. And in order to understand them, you need to be able to harness these skills of listening, of analyzing, of digesting, of humility. And I think these are all smaller or maybe contributing facets to what
Mm.
would be empathy at the end of the day. It's opening up so many questions for me right now, but I think what would be very useful and beneficial for myself and for our audience is to tell us a little bit more about your journey and what led you to start Empathy Everywhere.
So 2018, let's go back. I moved to Dubai and I went to take over an American corporate business. And if I'm very politically correct in how I frame it, let's say that when I got there, the business wasn't quite in the same situation that perhaps I had expected it to be when I took the job. And the honest truth, Ash, was that I was extremely overwhelmed. I had come from very corporate, also American businesses, but very corporate, huge businesses around the world when there was, 20 people in finance and many, many people around you. So leading was very much a team sport. And then when I took on this role in the Middle East at that time, I was very alone, as it were, in a small business. There's about 40 people. And the business was sinking, but I didn't know that. And nor did I have the skill sets to know how to fix it. So in that process of overwhelm, it really was. I didn't know what I was going to do. I went to see a business coach, my first and only, a phenomenal woman. And she was asking me about my leadership style and how I would approach these problems I was facing. And at the time, I was talking about intuition. I was talking about being an intuitive leader, which is what I thought I was and had always believed. But she asked me a question that changed my life, really, because she stopped me and she said, Mimi, is it intuition? Or is it empathy? And I remember thinking, no, 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 it's not. I mean, what's empathy got to do with anything? The
Mhm.
world is in a really different place. Probably today, your listeners, maybe they've heard people talking about empathy recently. Certainly, they've heard some of the other things you were touching on. You should listen, you should include, all of these things, right? These conversations in 2018 hadn't yet begun. Certainly, empathy was on no map anywhere, right? It just was not a conversation piece. So I left that session thinking, absolutely not. I mean, what's, so random. Today, that feels like a very odd feeling because, of course, now I live this every day. But I went home that night and I started to Google. We didn't have ChatGPT back then, but otherwise I would have used it,
My
right?
best friend.
Yeah, my best friend too. But I Googled it and I discovered what we spoke about earlier, this empathy deficit. And, we often talk about seeing an elephant in the room. This didn't feel like an elephant in a room. It felt like a mountain in a room, right? I remember sitting in my home thinking, how is no one talking about this? How is it there's this skill set that I've never given a huge amount of thought to until that day? And it is literally pulling apart our world, our communities, our success, our profit margins, and no one's talking about it. So I started to write. I never wanted to become an author. I was never one of those, children who dreamt of, being in a bookstore and seeing
Mhm.
my name. That was not the vision. I had been in corporate. I planned to always stay in corporate. I started to write for myself, actually, just to sort of work through this business challenge and what I was learning and this new concept. And the more I wrote, well, I never stopped really. It's been 6 years. You know, once I started, I couldn't stop. And a friend of mine said, "Well, why don't you write a book?" And I remember thinking, "Well, who?" And she said, "No, you." I said, "I can't write a book. You know, I'm not John Grisham. I didn't go to Harvard. I can't write a book." And she said, "No, no, you can, you know." And so I found a publisher and I did write that book. And it came out in 2020, at which point I was still very much in the corporate world. And then that book, along with a podcast that I had at the time, and 5,000 people came in the strange year that was
Wow.
2020. And life changed, Ash. You know, as I said earlier, this became me. The book became a bestseller. I've now just finished my third. I do this full time. But it really was, I felt a responsibility. Once I understood the size of the problem and I realized that no one was talking about it. And again, I really never dreamt it would become this. But I just felt like it was a conversation that was worth having, even though at that time nobody else did. So nobody was inviting me onto their podcast back then.
It sounded like the
Hmm.
very concept of this seemed very uncertain to you at the very beginning when this coach mentioned this to you, and realizing now, just from a basic research standpoint, that this gap existed for a long time. And then from a societal standpoint, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, we all experience disconnect. And I think your book really, what it sounds like, said the words of what everyone was thinking, but maybe couldn't necessarily articulate how they were feeling in this world.
Mm.
So during this time, especially in early on in this process, even with the 85,000 people who did latch on, did it ever cross your mind that it may feel too idealistic, or was there ever a time that you doubted this path? Did you have a moment of, what am I doing? Is this the right path for me?
I think it's both, the honest truth. I don't think I ever doubted empathy. I never doubted that the world needs this. Did I doubt myself 100 times a
Mm,
day? Probably. Do you know what I mean? Over those
sure.
years, of course, there has been, you know, there have been many, many moments of I guess, self doubt, of all those things you go through when you think, well, you know, should I do this? Is this the right thing? Can I do this? As anyone who's ever tried to found anything, and I definitely don't see myself as a founder in the American sense, kind of Silicon Valley, but just to found an idea, it is a very lonely journey, right? Because no one else is going to help you. And that was one of my learnings very early on. I think when you're in corporate, there's always someone else that cares about what you're doing because you're part of a team. So everyone has a goal. But of course, when you set out to do something like this, quite frankly, nobody cares except you and maybe your mum, right? So, and even then, she didn't care every week. So, I think, yeah, there was always moments of doubt. It's a very difficult journey. I feel quite passionate now about talking, particularly to women, about how hard this is. Because I think social media, and even though my social media is 1,000,000% authentic, there is nothing on there that is not 100% real. At the same time, of course, social media is a curated experience. So
Mm,
people will have the assumption that things are bigger, better, easier, smoother than they are because that's just how the platform works. And I
sure.
think it's very important for people to know how much you have to fight off things like doubt or imposter syndrome or months when you make less money or all of those things. You know, like I said in the beginning, honestly, Ash, I had to like build myself into these rooms. I remember the very first time I got invited to a conference called GITEX, which is the world's biggest technology conference that happens in Dubai every year. I've been going there with them for about 5 years. But the first year they invited me, and I said to the conference organizer, you know, I would like to talk about empathy in the role of technology. We hadn't really come to the AI revolution yet, but just in the role of technology. And she was like, no, you can't do that. And I was like, well, why not? She said, well, because it doesn't really make sense. You know, nobody wants to hear about that. So, you know, I had to be very patient. And I think today there's two words that really I live by. One is patience, and the other is tenacity. Because when you're trying to build a meaning to something that people don't understand, because the majority of people do not know what empathy is. They don't understand it. They don't get it. They think it's a soft skill. They might think it's sympathy or kindness or being nice. And I always say to them, please be nice, but that's not what I'm teaching. Um, so you have to be, I mean, that you have to be very resilient. You just have to keep going. So that was a very long way of saying, no, I never doubted the content, But I think we all doubt ourselves all the time. And if we pretend we don't, we're just probably lying to ourselves.
Being empathetic with ourselves in a way. We're not understanding ourselves. We're trying to mask the true feelings that we're feeling. And so now that we've really highlighted the importance of empathy and why you have found the value of dedicating your life's work to this purpose, I want to talk about how we can really bring it into action. So, and this is not just, we'll get to the individual level as well, but you work with world class leaders, policymakers, CEOs. So, what happens when you walk into these rooms and one person believes in your concept and saying, I want you to speak to this team about empathy? What do you anticipate the assumptions are in that room when you walk in? And what is your goal by the end of a session to get out of it? Because I'm assuming you're probably facing a bit of lack of understanding.
Well, the first thing I'd say, Ash, is that in empathy for those audiences in the corporate world, I will often tell that one believer, that one client, the head of HR or whoever's brought me in, not to use the word empathy in the title or the topic or the, maybe the masterclass or workshop or keynote, whatever it is that we're doing. Because in empathy for my audiences, I know that they don't know what it is and probably they won't be that interested and they might be confused and they might check out.
Mhm.
So that the term I use around the world is listening led leadership, which feels a lot more accessible to people. Listening is the skill set, the backbone to empathy, because of course, if you want to understand someone, you have to be curious, right? You have to listen to them to be able to understand, whether that's a toddler in your personal life or the CEO at work. So the first thing is that we will use context and titles and words to make sure that we bring people into that room with the most positive and open intentions as possible, because you don't want to have to start from below zero, right? I think the second thing is, and I've always believed this, that the clients I work with already want this work. I'm not going to sell it to people. Not really. I mean, I'll sell it from the stage when I'm sharing passion or doing a podcast like this. Hopefully, it convinces some people, right? But I'm not going to push my way into an organization. If that business wants this type of motivation and inspiration, feels that this is of value, believes in that balance of what I talk about, which is humanism alongside capitalism. We all need to make money, but this is how to make more money, right? So that's the first thing. And then I also, I mean, I use a lot of data. So I will start very early on by telling them that these types of skill sets lead to 23% higher profits and 48% higher levels of innovation, 34% higher levels of output. So I will use a lot of data. This is mainly Gallup data,
Mhm.
Mercer, big research
Yeah.
organization. So I make sure that the business case is there. And then the last piece is that I try and do it with such passion and such authentic belief, because I really do believe in it. As yet, I don't think I've ever had a room that hasn't come with me. Will they action it? That's up to them. That's a personal choice. Empathy is a choice. You choose to use this skill set. But without a doubt, they understand. And one of my favorite messages, Ash, and I put it on a slide, is this is not a concept. It's a memory. You know this. You were born with this. And I often show them a video of my daughter, actually, which was a very candid video that she joined me on a shoot one day, and she's 7 years old. And in this video, I ask her, what happens if someone doesn't listen to you? And she says, in all of her cute 7 year
Mm.
old, she says, well, if you don't listen to me, I don't think you like me, and I don't think you want to be my friend. And I say to the audience, our children know, you know, how did we forget? Maybe we don't want to be friends at work, but the context is the same. If you don't listen, I don't think you're interested. I am not of value to you. So, how are you going to drive me to double digit growth or improve performance? So, at the end of those sessions, Ash, as I said, even when I go to quite traditional, very conservative environments, I do a lot of work in the Gulf and in India, even when the room is 1,500, mainly men in black suits, and I'm
Mhm.
on stage in a pink dress, I generally don't have a problem convincing them as humans. As I said, how they action that in their businesses is a different discussion.
So everyone knows you have to be an empathetic person, but they're probably tying that empathy to, oh, I need to be an empathetic person for my partner, for my
Mm,
children. And yes, obviously, I should probably be empathetic towards my team so they listen to me and respect me. But the true connection and value of empathy, let's say in a business scenario or business case, when it's just so explicitly showcased with data, that's what's so powerful. And actually, this reminds me a lot of an episode we did last season with
mm,
the chief sustainability officer of L'Oreal. And obviously, the conversation is sustainability and how people are not prioritizing it because they often assume that it has no business value. But
mm.
there is a financial value to being sustainable. And I think we make assumptions like sustainability that empathy does not have a financial value at the end of the day, whether that is productivity that results in a dollar amount. And so speaking that language is really how you are convincing these people this is important. This is going to help you achieve what you need to achieve in a healthy way that also moves our society forward.
And it needs to be delivered very functionally. I think I knew that in the
Yeah.
beginning,
Mm.
that, as I said, when I started this, there were very few people talking about empathy, but those that were, I mean, there were some very prominent figures in some of the big universities and stuff in the USA, but on the whole, outside of a handful, you would find empathy maybe in soft skills training occasionally, probably in a yoga class, in very kind of left of center conversations. I knew, because I'd grown up in the corporate world, that I needed to bring it into the center, as you said, with data, with experiences, with case studies, with examples. But I also knew that this is a human reality. And the challenge was not whether they understood why they needed it. It was whether they knew what it was, and they don't. And the world still doesn't, which is why I get up every day
Mhm.
to do this. People don't know what empathy is. They confuse it with sympathy, which is an emotion, or compassion, which is an action. Both of those things, sympathy and compassion, have limits. You can theoretically burn out of both of them. Empathy has no limits. You can't empathize too much. You can't ever have too much data about a person or a situation. And in fact, what research shows us is that the more empathy you have, the less burnout you will experience in your work and your career. We need to educate people on what this is for them to be able to put those numbers to them. It's Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, who says that people think empathy is something you reserve for your family and friends, but they're wrong. This is an existential business priority. So once people understand the what, the value is very easy to associate.
And you mentioned it that empathy is often associated with this false connotation of being soft.
Mm.
So, would you say data and facts is the best way to dismantle that? Or do you have any additional best practices for those who are listening and are really finally being bought into the power of empathy right now? Those who are listening and are like, yes, I believe it. And I can now see where it's lacking in my organization. So, I want to share this message. How can I showcase that this power of empathy is essentially a hard skill?
So, Ash, I talk about three steps or
Mhm.
stages that everyone and every organization that's open to this needs to go through. The first is awareness. So, if you are listening today and you buy into this, you have to be aware, as I am every single minute of every day, that not everybody else is, right? So, the first step is awareness. You have to find ways to bring that awareness into your team, into your board. And data is a very good way of doing that. And there is now, today, more and more of that out there. Things like Gallup, the Workplace Insider, Business Insider report. There's many different reports out there today, and anyone who wants them can find me on social media and just ask them. I'll give them out. Driving awareness, giving people the data, showing them the size of the problem, and actually where this becomes a solution. And that is something you can talk about for hours and hours, and 2-day workshops on the value of this and how to practice it. Because the second step is intention. You have to intentionally make a change. So I mentioned earlier that listening and listening led leadership is the way to deliver on this. But to listen is an active skill set. So perhaps you're listening to Ash and I today, you're in your car, you're in the traffic, you're commuting to work. You can hear my voice right now, but are you listening to me? or are you just hearing me? It's a very big difference. To hear is a passive reality for the majority of us who have good functioning hearing. To listen is to decode, is to gather understanding or insight from what you're having access to. So, the question here to ask yourself is, am I listening to understand, or am I listening to reply? And in the majority of our conversations and meetings and team schools, most people, most of the time, are listening to reply. You are waiting for a gap to share an opinion or answer a question or help somebody, right? So the second phase in those organizations is to establish and build intention. And then the third is accountability, because what you do not measure will not manifest. So you have to create accountability. Empathy without accountability is, it just gets lost. This is a hard skill. It's hard to find, it's hard to master, it's really hard to maintain. And as we said earlier, it has very hard business impact. So, very, very easy results to sell. But I think for anyone listening, you have to look at how to go through those phases, bringing awareness, driving intention, and then building accountability.
And you mentioned that that accountability piece has to be measurable.
Mm.
So, for one who is really starting to embed this into their practice to be a better human to society, what are some ways that we can measure empathy?
So empathy is something you have to measure over time. This is not something that you can measure between January and June.
Sure.
So on average, you need at least 12 to 18 months to be able to measure that. You can do it through various different ways, whether that's engagement surveys, whether it's sentiment analysis, whether you're looking at tracking values in your organization, because the steps to empathy are very rational, very functional around things like, like listening, cohesion, collaboration, psychological safety, which is a huge part of building empathetic cultures. So these are many of these metrics are metrics that you might have in your organization. It's just about relooking how you measure them and how you establish what empathy means within that business. And then you can track it over time. What's important in that intention and the accountability piece is that people have to know it's an expectation. So, in some of the clients I work with, they will add it to their values. I worked with one just last week in Singapore who, in a very, let's say, hard edged industry of mechanical engineering and oil and gas, they're kind of in the middle, very hard edged, tough, dangerous at times industry. And they felt that they needed to add the word empathy into their core values. They had a value of respect and they have renamed it respect and empathy. So they have put it into a value, which therefore means it's measurable, but of course it's also connected to KPIs. So the KPIs, they don't have to be connected to values, but obviously often they are. But to have a KPI in there, and you can add one, if you have 4 or 5, you can add a final one that sets that expectation for being a listening led leader or a listening led team member, that tells people that as a manager, I am expecting to see you listen to each other and to listen to those around us. So it is definitely measurable, but it's, as I said earlier, it has to be an intentional shift. You have to build this in. We have two great enemies really for being able to do this well. One is high stress and the other is low time. And if I asked your audience to put their hands up, not if they're driving, but to put their hands up, if you suffer or struggle with low time and high stress, I would guess, Ash, we're nearly 100% of the people with us today.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. So, because this is a skill set built into the prefrontal cortex, this is a neurological capacity, which means that when you have very high stress, low time, you're running, your brain is in what's called the fight or flight response. We won't go into it too deeply today, but fundamentally, what that means is your brain, from a physiological and a neurological reality, is shifting energy, blood, hormones away from the parts of the brain that strategically access empathy, that access these human skill sets. So, one of the core pieces of being able to actually sustain this is to make sure that within those organizations you have higher levels of psychological safety, lower levels of stress, and you create time and expectation to see these skill sets so that you can override that very natural, very unavoidable reality of stress that we live within.
So, and this is really interesting because I do want to get into the part about individual awareness around practicing empathy. And from what it sounds like, if I were to practice this tomorrow and almost do a gut check or reality check or reflection of where do I have the opportunity to be empathetic, or did I have an opportunity to be empathetic today? These are two aspects I would look at. Okay, what was my stress level like today? What was my time like today? Did I create the space that allowed me, or do I have the space that will allow myself to be empathetic today and practice empathy? I'm almost seeing it like a morning activity or a night activity.
Mm,
So, with these 2 points and any other best practices that you have as an individual, how can we practice empathy, and how can we also teach empathy to others around us?
The first thing I'll
Mhm.
say is it a teachable skill? Yes, it's been proven. So we can teach it. We can teach it by role modeling, but we can also teach it by, active
Mhm.
sessions when we teach people the skill sets to do this, which a lot of it, as I mentioned earlier, comes back to the ability to listen. The funny thing is, we tell each other to listen all the time. If you think about children, small children, there's always someone telling a child, listen to mummy, listen to daddy, listen to your teacher. But when do we ever teach each other to listen? Quite frankly, not enough. When it comes to some of those personal drivers that you were talking about earlier, I think the funny thing about time, of course, it's one of today's scarcest resources. But the way that the brain works, our conscious drives our subconscious. There's like a circle between the two. And the reason I say that is a couple of years ago, I made a very conscious decision to not use the phrase, I don't have enough time or I didn't have time. Instead, to say, I didn't create enough time or I will create time. Because the way that the brain works, this comes from neuroscience. Once you tell your brain that you will create time for something, you will, because it feeds the subconscious and then back again, right? So often, most days, someone says to me, how do you have time for all this, Mimi?
Mhm.
And I always say the same thing to them. I say, well, I create time. And I believe that, Ash, because even for me, sometimes I look at one day and I think, how did I do all those things in a day, right? So I think the first thing is about mindset. We're all going to rush, right? We have to make very conscious decisions as to where to create that time and where to spend our time. The second thing is, I think, and it is a progress and it's progress and it's process, but I wouldn't make I should be empathetic with someone today your goal, but instead, how do I become more empathetic in life, right? Because you don't want to set yourself up to fail. And I always say to people that the gap between expectation and reality is disappointment. So if you constantly set yourself this maybe unachievable goal because of the day you have ahead, then by the time you get to bedtime, you're like, oh, I didn't do it again. And eventually you give up,
You won't
right?
do
Because
it
of that
anymore.
disappointment, right?
Yeah.
So instead of that, I try to tell people just to make really like micro shifts in their life that allow them to connect further. And the thing that's important about that is you're not only doing it for others, because when you empathize with others, when you connect with others, you will see the oxytocin, for example, which is the happy hormone, the love hormone in your body, go up for you too, because it's pro social. So the brain evolved in a way, a very clever brain, that to connect with others is rewarding for you, makes you feel good, physiologically feel better, as much as it enables the other person. So making these micro decisions, these micro habits to connect with others more often is not just about being good in the world, it's about being good to yourself. So I think it's a mindset shift, Ash, on how to start those days and become a more connected, empathetic person in the world. And again, I just want to be really clear with your listeners. I'm not asking you to be nice all the time. I'm not asking you to never make a hard decision. I'm not saying you can't fire people when you have to fire people. All of these tough decisions in life can be done with empathy, can be done
Mhm.
with connection to others, can be done with
Mhm.
deeper understanding, and still let you go into the office today and do the tough things that we all have to do on a daily basis.
Mhm. And it's so funny you say that. I sometimes catch myself saying too much. If only I had 25 hours in the day. So, one, that is going to be a lesson that I'm going to take away immediately. And the second one is this idea of a daily expectation that we try and set for ourselves makes it sometimes unattainable, or you set yourself up for disappointment. But the practice of empathy should almost eventually become a subconscious practice for us. Because if I'm speaking with someone, and even if I had a pretty cruddy day, the way I show up and listen that practice should remain the same. I shouldn't be listening to respond or listening for my turn to speak, but I should be listening with intent. And even that much will boost those chemicals in my brain that eventually give back to me in the way that our society mandates us. And I feel like to be empathetic, to be a good human is considered almost to be a very daunting task at times, especially with the pressures of the world around us. But you sometimes get in the way of yourself when it comes to
Mhm.
just practicing empathy in very micro doses along the way.
And the great thing is, Ash, that when you do that, you will live longer. So there's a
Mm,
lot of conversations out there around longevity, right? It's trending everywhere. We all want to live long, healthy, happy lives. But you can run as many triathlons and take as many organic supplements as you like. And
mhm,
back to the very beginning of this show, if you are lonely, you won't do very well because we are pro-social. So from a data point of view, now there are 900,000 people a year who die of loneliness. You are statistically likely to live 8 years less if you are not connected. Your immune system will be stronger. If you, God forbid, get a disease or a chronic illness, you can recover. You're more likely to recover when you're connected to others. So, not only, as you said, are these expectations as good humans and to rebuild society, America, the world, right, in all of these wonderful ways to drive 23% higher profit and build your innovation pipeline and compete with your products in the market, right? But you'll also live longer. So there really is no downside.
yeah, I mean this idea of empathy, it's one that now is making me really think about how the impact of a concept that we sometimes overlook or we tend to bottle up with all the other important qualities that are mandated, but we tend to just lump it all together with everything else. But I hope if you've made it this far in this episode that you really see the value of such a simple word and the value that it carries, not only for yourself, but for those around you, for society at large, and that there is data, that there is factual benefit, that there is profit, that there is this concrete value that I guarantee there's a piece of it missing from your life. And if you just take anything from this is to reinvigorate empathy in your life, and I'm sure you'll see some bright lights at the end of this journey. Um, this has been so wonderful, Mimi. Thank you so much. I urge everyone to really reclaim empathy. If you've heard the facts from Mimi, but just truly see for yourself the value that empathy can bring into your life. And so, Mimi, on the You Live and You Learn podcast, we believe the duration of your experience is not what matters, but it's the wisdom, it's the insights, it's the lessons we glean along the way. So, what is your number one life lesson that you want to leave with our listeners today?
Mm. So, Ash, thank you for asking. I'm going to cheat and say two things, but one is a
Please.
life lesson and one is a tip because I really want
Okay.
to leave the listeners with one small thing that they can do to try this, to follow your advice that you just gave them. So, the tip that I want to leave with them is today to just try and use people's names more. Our name is the first gift we were ever given, and it's a phenomenal way to start those micro habits in empathy. So, when you pick up your coffee or when you see the security staff at the door today, use their name and try and practice that often, even with your own family, your own team. That's a really good place to start. So, I wanted just to leave that with your listeners. But in terms of my life lesson, um, I think I would I think I would say this. I think I would say that it's really important for us to always remember that we're more alike than we are different. And the media grows and thrives on trying to convince us otherwise and trying to highlight the things that put us apart and the things that make us different or distinct. And that creates this vicious cycle that continues to disconnect our world. So my last message would be to always remember that the things that bring us together, we all want to be loved, we all want to grow, we all want to be happy, everybody wants a hero and a happy ending, right? The things that pull us together are far more plentiful than the things that pull us apart.
I couldn't agree more. I could not agree more, Mimi. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your fierce dedication to empathy. Your passion truly showcased throughout this past time that we spent together. And by the way, I did notice how much you said my name during this conversation. So it was something I was like, wow, she's really saying my name every single time. And I really enjoyed that. So we built this connection just in this past hour. So thank you so much for the wisdom you have shared with us today. And I want people to continue to learn from you. So if you don't mind just taking a moment, telling our listeners where they can learn more about your work, your books, your podcast, how they can get connected to you and empathy everywhere as well.
Super. Well, my most recent book is called Empathy at Work and it's available on Amazon. My new book will be out in October this
Oh,
year.
congratulations.
Thank you. You can find me on my website, which is www.empathyeverywhere.co. Or if you search for my name, Mimi Nicklin, you will find me very actively on Instagram, LinkedIn, and also YouTube.
Wonderful. We'll be sure to link all of that as well in the bio of this episode. Mimi, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.